Somewhere in the darkest corners of the internet, there's a horror game that secretly turns on your webcam to watch you play in the dark. And what happens afterwards is genuinely creepy. Another one hid real-world GPS coordinates leading to a restricted, abandoned diamond mine in Russia, causing wild speculations. When a massive AAA studio makes a horror game, you always have a safety net. But in the indie space, that safety net doesn't exist. These games are unfiltered and raw, solo developers pouring their darkest intrusive thoughts into a game engine. And sometimes, this absolute freedom results in software that feels seriously illegal to look at. Today, we are diving straight down the most disturbing indie games ever created. Quick heads up before we boot up, we're discussing heavy psychological themes and real-world panics today. I'm keeping things respectful, but consider this your content warning. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. Level 1. Postal 1. When you talk about controversial indie titles, you absolutely have to start with the granddaddy of them all, Postal 1. Released back in 1997 by a small, completely independent studio called Running with Scissors, this game didn't just push the envelope, it set the envelope on fire. You play as a guy known only as the Postal Dude. And mentally, let's just say he's not in a good place. The game kicks off with him getting evicted from his home, but the narrative quickly spirals into complete, terrifying delusion. He genuinely believes that everyone in the world around him has been infected by a disease he calls the hate plague. In his mind, this plague is driving the population insane, and he's convinced that he's the only human being left who's immune. So, driven by his delusions, he turns against the world around him to survive what he thinks is the end of society. Now, on the surface, this is just an isometric late 90s shooter. Postal 1 doesn't get under your skin through its pixelated graphics. It's the audio design. That's the real horror. As you progress through the levels, moving from your neighborhood to a mine to a military base, the game forces you into the Postal Dude's fracturing mind. The background music isn't music at all. It's a chaotic, ambient drone of sirens, screeching metal, and demonic screams. But worst of all are the voices. The whispers in his head get louder and more aggressive the further you play, making you feel his paranoia firsthand. Eventually, the screen fades to black. The game reveals that the Postal Dude hasn't cleansed anything. He's simply been captured, straitjacketed, and locked away in a high-security mental asylum. But here's the kicker that modern fans discovered. Years later, the developers released an HD remake, and they completely changed the ending. Instead of an asylum, the game ends with a somber, quiet funeral scene. Fans immediately tore this apart and came up with a massive theory. The funeral belongs to the Postal Dude's own child. According to this theory, the hate plague never existed. The entire violent game was just a hallucination, a total psychological breakdown of a grieving father who simply couldn't cope with reality. Doki Doki Literature Club. If you were anywhere near the internet in 2017, you probably know about this legendary bait and switch. Developed by Team Salvato, this game markets itself as the most generic, brightly covered, overly sweet anime dating simulator imaginable. You play as a high schooler who gets roped into joining a literature club by your childhood best friend. For the first hour, it's exactly what it says on the tin. You write poems, listen to upbeat acoustic music, and you try to romance the different club members. But then the cracks start to show. The dialogue of your friends starts hinting at severe, crippling real-world mental health struggles. And then at the end of Act 1, the game takes a shocking turn where the code literally starts breaking apart, and one of your friends suddenly disappears from the story. From that moment on, Doki Doki Literature Club stops being a dating sim and turns into an aggressive, fourth-wall-breaking psychological horror masterpiece. The game actively starts gaslighting you. Character sprites become horribly distorted. The background music warps and plays slightly off-tempo. Text boxes fill with unreadable, glitching characters. And then you realize the terrifying truth. One of the characters, Monica, is completely self-aware. She knows she's in a video game. She knows you are sitting behind a screen. and she's so desperately jealous of the other characters that she starts actively going into the game's actual directory folder and deleting their character files to forcefully remove them from the narrative. To beat the game, you literally have to open your computer's file explorer and delete her file in return. It was a brilliant, terrifying experience that proved you don't need jump scares or monsters to deeply unsettle a player. I'm Scared. Released back in 2012 by a solo developer named Ivan Zanotti, I'm Scared was a pioneer. Visually, it looks like an old-school, low-poly Windows 95 screensaver. It's heavily pixelated, grainy, and incredibly dark. You wake up in a room and are immediately hunted by a terrifying, floating entity simply known as Whiteface. But I'm Scared doesn't want to just scare your in-game avatar. It wants to scare you. When Whiteface catches you, the game doesn't give you a traditional game over screen. Instead, the game purposefully force crashes itself. Your window closes. You're staring at your own desktop. But when you look closely, you realize something's wrong. The game has been quietly generating strange, threatening text files and dropping them directly onto your actual computer desktop. You open a file and it reads, "I need a heart to open this door." You restart the game, find a heart, and progress. Later, the game will minimize itself, open your actual internet browser, and direct you to obscure, creepy images. It creates folders. It hides keys inside those folders that you have to physically drag and drop to progress the story. I'm Scared made you feel like you hadn't just downloaded a horror game. It made you feel like you had willingly installed a sentient virus that was slowly taking over your machine. Level 2. Polybius. You simply cannot discuss disturbing video game lore without touching the holy grail of arcade myths, Polybius. The legend goes that in 1981, a mysterious, unmarked arcade cabinet popped up in a handful of suburban arcades around Portland, Oregon. The game was allegedly developed by a shadowy company named Sinneslöschen, which roughly translates from German to sense delete. According to the stories, Polybius was an abstract, geometric, Tempest-style shooter. But it didn't just entertain kids, it broke them. The myth claims that playing the game caused intense psychoactive effects. Players reported severe motion sickness, amnesia, insomnia, night terrors, and even auditory hallucinations. The machines were incredibly addictive, causing massive fights among kids to try to get the next turn. But the most disturbing part of the legend revolves around who was collecting the quarters. Arcade owners allegedly reported that mysterious men in black suits would show up to the arcades after hours. They weren't there to empty the coin boxes. They were there to extract the data from the motherboards. So was Polybius a secret MK Ultra government experiment designed to test subliminal messaging on unsuspecting teenagers? Probably not. Historians widely consider it to be an urban legend. It was likely born from a combination of real kids getting seizures from early vector graphics games, mixed with the fact that the FBI actually did raid several Portland arcades in the 80s to bust illegal gambling rings. But the idea of a video game specifically engineered to break the human mind is a primal fear that has never really left the community. Rule of Rose. Rule of Rose is an incredibly obscure psychological horror game released for the PlayStation 2 in 2006. Developed by a small studio called Punchline, this was a beautifully atmospheric, incredibly melancholy game. You play as a young woman named Jennifer who finds herself trapped in a bizarre, nightmarish orphanage run by a cruel hierarchy of young girls calling themselves the Red Crayon Aristocrats. The game dealt heavily with the themes of childhood trauma, isolation, and the unique, psychological cruelty that kids can inflict on one another. It was dark, yes, but it was thoughtful. However, in 2006, a European politician named Franco Frattini caught wind of the game's premise, and he sparked an absolute continent-wide moral panic. Major magazines, tabloids, and television news networks ran with the story, trying to outdo each other with sensational headlines. They claimed the game rewarded players for unspeakable acts of violence. The twist? Literally none of that was true. The media had completely fabricated the controversy. The politicians making the loudest noise admitted later that they had never even seen a second of gameplay, let alone played it themselves. But the truth didn't matter. The outrage was so incredibly loud, and the public pressure was so immense that the game was effectively banned across large parts of Europe, and its UK release was entirely cancelled. The media just made stuff up. completely fabricated it, and a genuinely good game got destroyed for it. Worlds.com. While the media was busy panicking over fake controversies, they were completely ignoring the actual deeply unsettling places that were quietly existing on the internet. Places like Worlds.com. Built all the way back in 1995, this was one of the very first 3D chat clients ever made. Think of it like a prehistoric dial-up version of VR chat. Back in the day, it was a booming hub. It even had high-profile backing from celebrities like Steven Spielberg. People would log in, pick a low-resolution avatar, and explore massive, user-created rooms. But as technology advanced, people moved on to better things. By the early 2000s, the platform was largely abandoned. But here is the chilling part. The servers were never actually shut down. Fast forward to today, decades later, and if you manage to download the ancient client and log in, you'll find a bizarre, liminal wasteland of glitchy textures and forgotten digital architecture. And you won't be alone. There's a small, dedicated group of users who still log into Worlds.com every single day. They wear bizarre, custom-made, often disturbing avatars, and for the most part, they don't talk. You can wander into a pitch-black, user-created room that looks like a dungeon, and find 3 avatars just silently standing in the corner, staring at a wall. One user in particular, a mythical figure named Nexilist, became famous for silently following new players around the maps, watching them from a distance. The sheer emptiness of the platform has spawned endless rumors about deep web cults, secret societies, and hackers using the dead servers to communicate in plain sight. Whether those rumors are true or not, the feeling of walking through a digital graveyard where the ghosts are actually real people is an unmatched level of dread. Level 3. Petscop. It started innocently enough in 2017 as a simple Let's Play series on YouTube. The videos were uploaded by a quiet, unassuming guy named Paul, who claimed he found an unfinished, unreleased PlayStation 1 game from 1997. When Paul boots it up, the title screen says it was developed by a company called Garalina. At first glance, it looks like a goofy, colorful, and slightly clunky Pokemon clone where your goal is to walk around solving simple puzzles to catch weird little pets. But then Paul finds a note. It tells him to input a specific cheat code. When he does, the bright, colorful world of the pet catching game vanishes. Paul's character descends into something called the New Maker Plane. From there, the game devolves into a staggeringly complex, deeply disturbing puzzle. The vibrant colors are replaced by pitch-black voids, sterile brick rooms, and cryptic mechanical structures. Instead of catching typical video game monsters, the game suddenly tasks you with tracking down characters that seem to represent real missing people from the developer's own family. You wander through the dark, deciphering cryptic notes left by a sinister figure named Marvin. You encounter a windmill that rotates backwards, a massive underground machine, and a floating red object simply called Tool that answers the player's questions in terrifyingly vague ways. The game slowly reveals itself to be an interactive confession. It tells a chilling story about a broken family and a dark history of real-world disappearances. The sheer depth of the lore is insane, but what makes Petscop so incredibly disturbing is how quiet it is. There are no jump scares, there are no sudden loud noises or monsters chasing you. It relies entirely on the cold, sterile feeling of wandering around a digital ghost town that clearly wasn't meant for you to see. It feels less like a video game and more like a piece of interactive psychological evidence. Kanye Quest 3030. Kanye Quest 3030 sounds like a complete joke. It was released in 2013 as a satirical 2D RPG built in RPG Maker. The premise is absurd. You play as Kanye West, who falls through a garbage chute into a dystopian future, where he has to fight evil clones of famous musicians like Tupac and Biggie. It was hilarious, and players loved it for what it was. Until 2 years later, a player randomly typed the word "ascend" into a specific dialogue terminal in the game. Suddenly, the goofy rap game vanished. The screen cut to black, replaced by a hidden cryptic survey interface. The text on the screen asked a simple question: do you want to ascend? If the player clicked yes, the game began asking highly personal psychological questions. It asked about the player's fears, their relationship with their family, and their general mental state. Eventually, the terminal prompted the player to input real-world contact information. Internet sleuths dug into this code and found out this hidden section was allegedly a recruitment tool for a bizarre New Age online cult called Ascensionism. The game was a Trojan horse, a popular joke game acting as a massive honeypot to harvest data and recruit vulnerable, curious people into a fringe internet group. Level 4. Station.exe. Back in 2013, a random post popped up on the paranormal board of 4chan. The user claimed they'd found something weird at a tech expo. Among a bunch of normal CDs, there was a disc with a mysterious game called Station.exe, built in Blender by an unknown developer. Just a name and a file. Right away, booting up Station.exe drops you in a pitch-dark, abandoned facility with unsettling ambient noise. The whole place just feels wrong. As you start walking through the empty building, you quickly realize that you're not alone. Massive, floating, lifeless human faces start following you through the dark. They don't move or animate like normal video game enemies. They just hover completely still, until they suddenly snap toward you. And if they catch you, you die. But the game doesn't give you a traditional game over screen or let you try again. It violently shuts itself down. That is creepy enough, but at one point, players digging through the code discovered GPS coordinates hidden on a wall inside the game. And these weren't just random generated numbers. They led to a very real place on our planet, specifically an abandoned diamond mine in Russia. The structure of this real-world mine closely resembles the dark facility you walk through inside the game. Now, this is where the mystery really picks up. The actual mine is a highly restricted area, so nobody could just walk in and check if the game was referencing something real hidden there. But if this was just a weird, random, obscure indie horror game, why would it point to a real abandoned site? And it doesn't stop there. When players started deep diving into the game's actual files, they found even stranger stuff. There was a link to a password-protected website and direct references to old, archived threads from 4chan's K-board, a specific community dedicated to military surplus and tactical gear. So now you have a mysterious game pointing to a real abandoned location with connections to tactical internet communities and a hidden website that no one has been able to access. Lostboy.exe. Lostboy.exe first popped up on 4chan's paranormal and video game boards back in 2012. It was just a random, creepy game floating around the internet, with the name Rob attached to it as the supposed developer. The game itself is pretty simple. You wander through a lo-fi, maze-like environment filled with satanic imagery. Distorted religious paintings stare at you from the pixelated walls. It gives off classic eerie horror vibes. A little weird, a little disturbing, but nothing too wild. But as Lostboy.exe started getting passed around forums and file-sharing sites, someone with very bad intentions decided to mess with it. Malicious actors took the original game and injected it with a remote access Trojan and re-uploaded the game. So if you downloaded the wrong version from the wrong link, you weren't just getting a creepy indie game. You were unknowingly installing a highly aggressive virus that gave a hacker full, unrestricted access to your computer. They could dig through your personal files. They could steal your data without you even realizing it. And most terrifyingly, they could remotely turn on your webcam and watch you play the game in the dark. The game became absolutely infamous for this. Fast forward to 2023, more than a decade later, and this mystery finally got some answers. A French YouTuber named Faldup managed to track down Rob, the original creator of the clean version of the game. According to Rob, he was once part of a small group of indie developers, which allegedly even included the creator of the hit game Risk of Rain. Lostboy.exe was just a harmless side project, made purely to be scary and simple. But a banned roleplay group from 4chan apparently wanted to get revenge, and they used his game as the perfect disguise to spread their virus. Yume Nikki. If you somehow survived the malware and the Trojans of the early 2000s internet, you might stumble onto Yume Nikki. Made in 2004 by an anonymous Japanese developer known only as Kikiyama, it is widely considered the grandfather of surreal indie horror. There's no dialogue in this game. There's no combat. There's no real plot explained to the player. You play as a young girl named Maratsuki, who refuses to leave her small apartment. All she does and all you can do is go to sleep and explore her dreams. And those dreams are deeply, profoundly wrong. When you fall asleep, you enter a nexus of doors that leads to surreal, infinitely looping landscapes. You wander through worlds filled with floating heads, bleeding abstract shapes, and massive, unblinking eyes watching you from the background. The atmosphere is incredibly heavy and oppressive. There are no jump scares, except for one legendary random event involving a character named Uboa. If you flick a light switch in a seemingly normal room, there is a small chance the screen will flash, the music will distort, and a shrieking, melting face will trap you in an inescapable black void. Yume Nikki is an interactive masterclass in portraying severe depression, isolation, and the darkest corners of the subconscious mind. When the game suddenly just cuts to black at the very end without explaining a single thing, man, it leaves you completely stunned. It's easily one of the most haunting things I've ever played. Level 5. My House.wad. Welcome to Level 5. This is the point in the iceberg where we look at what happens when gamers take existing, familiar engines and twist them into something entirely unrecognizable. Let's look at My House.wad. On the surface, this is just a custom level for the original 1993 Doom. It was uploaded to a modding forum by a user named Veg, supposedly as a tribute to a deceased childhood friend who had tried to build his own house in the Doom engine years ago. When you boot it up, you spawn outside a completely normal, quiet suburban house. There are no demons, just a driveway, a front door, and a nicely furnished living room. But the second you start exploring, you walk through a door that should lead to the backyard, but instead you're standing in a mirrored version of the house. You look out a window and see a completely different time zone. My House.wad utilizes impossible, non-Euclidean geometry to break the fundamental rules of the ancient Doom engine. The house infinitely folds in on itself. Hallways stretch into the darkness. Stairs lead you to places you've already been. But the horror isn't just technical. Paired with a deeply emotional, 60-page Google Drive journal linked to the mod, the game reveals itself to be a terrifying study of grief. It transforms a classic boomer shooter into an inescapable, liminal nightmare about losing someone you love and trying to process a world that no longer makes sense. No players online. Then there's no players online. Imagine booting up an ancient, dead multiplayer shooter from the late 90s. You log into a server, but obviously the player count is 0. The servers have been empty for a decade. You're just wandering around a low-resolution capture the flag map, listening to the hollow echo of your own footsteps. It's peak liminal horror, a digital space meant for crowds, now completely abandoned. You pick up the enemy flag just to see if the game still works, and then a sound plays. A message pops up in the chat box in the corner of your screen. Someone else has joined the server. But this is where the surface level scare ends, and the real rabbit hole begins. Because No Players Online isn't just a spooky ghost game, it's a massive, incredibly tragic ARG. If you try to interact with a silent second player, the game eventually crashes. But if you start digging into the environment, you find a hidden VHS tape. Playing this tape reveals the true, heartbreaking story of the game's creator, a man named John. John's wife passed away, and in a state of absolute crippling grief, he attempted something impossible. He used a bizarre occult ritual to digitize her consciousness and upload her soul into the only place he could think of, his empty, abandoned multiplayer game. The ghost wandering around the server isn't a monster, it's his wife, trapped in an endless, empty digital purgatory. And then the game breaks the fourth wall entirely. John communicates with you, the player. He begs you not to close the game. He begs you not to shut down the server, because if you do, you'll permanently delete the last remaining piece of his wife. It takes a simple, spooky premise and turns it into a devastating moral dilemma that forces you to pull the plug. JVK1166Z.esp. And if we're talking about mods that completely consume the people playing them, we have to talk about the legendary JVK116Z.esp for Morrowind. The story goes that this was a corrupted mod file passed around dark, invite-only forums in the early 2000s. If you were brave enough to load it, the game's main quest was immediately broken. The first thing you would notice is the NPCs. Instead of going about their daily routines, all the characters in the game would walk outside at night, stand perfectly still, and tilt their heads up to look at the sky. If you tried to talk to them, they would only say one thing: watch the sky. But the sky wasn't normal. Players who dug into the game files realized the night sky texture had been replaced by a deeply unsettling, real-world photograph of a dark, starry void that shouldn't be in the game. Meanwhile, your character's health would constantly drain. You couldn't sleep to restore it, because if you closed your eyes in the game, you died. You were being hunted by a broken, crawling character model known only as the Assassin. But the Assassin didn't act like a normal video game enemy. It only moved when you weren't looking at it. If you turned your camera away, you would hear crawling noises rapidly approaching your back. But the absolute peak of this mod's horror was the portrait room. Deep inside a newly added dungeon, players reported finding a massive hall filled with picture frames. And the images inside those frames weren't game textures. The mod was actively pulling personal photos straight from the player's own real-life hard drive and displaying them on the walls. The original player who documented this mod slowly lost his actual mind. He refused to let his character die, so he kept his computer running for days. He stopped sleeping and started seeing things like the Assassin crawling through his actual bedroom at night. His final forum posts were frantic, disjointed ramblings about a locked door at the bottom of the dungeon that he was desperate to open. He completely lost his grip on reality, proving that sometimes the code doesn't just stay on the screen. It infects the person sitting at the keyboard. Level 6. Welcome to the game. We're plunging into Level 6. This is the tier where indie games stop trying to scare you with monsters and start targeting your very real-world paranoia. Let's look at a game that simulates the darkest places on the internet. Welcome to the game. Developed by Reflect Studios, this game puts you in the shoes of an investigative journalist sitting at a computer desk in a quiet apartment. Your goal is to browse a simulated version of the deep web. You have to hunt down hidden links, avoid police tracking, and search for an elusive, highly restricted server hidden at the very bottom of the network. The game forces you to read through deeply unsettling simulated deep web websites. But the horror doesn't stay on your virtual monitor. While you're staring intently at the screen, trying to crack hashes and find links, you're being hunted in the real world. Hackers try to breach your connection, forcing you to frantically defend your IP address. And much worse, you'll occasionally hear footsteps outside your virtual apartment door. If you don't immediately turn off your desk lamp, hide under your desk, and stay perfectly still, a hitman will break down your door and end your run. It's a masterclass in split-focus tension. It makes you hyper-aware of your own surroundings, turning the simple act of browsing the web into a sweat-inducing nightmare. Iron Lung. And finally, at the bottom of Level 6, we have the ultimate claustrophobia simulator. Released in 2022 by David Szymanski, Iron Lung operates on a premise that sounds like a fever dream. Decades ago, an event called the Quiet Rapture occurred. Every single habitable planet and star in the universe simply vanished. The only remnants of humanity are trapped on decaying space stations. You play as a convict, and you're forced into an expedition you are absolutely not expected to survive. You're bolted inside a tiny, rusted one-man submarine called the Iron Lung. The hatch is literally welded shut from the outside. You're dropped into a barren moon that doesn't have an ocean of water, but an ocean of blood. Here's the terrifying catch. The submarine has no windows. Because of the massive pressure of the red ocean, if you had a window, it would shatter instantly. You have to navigate the sub using only a map, X and Y coordinates, and proximity sensors. The only way to see what is outside in the deep red water is to press a button, wait for a mechanical whir, and take a grainy, low-resolution photograph with a camera mounted on the outside of the hull. You spend the entire game staring at a blank wall, listening to the groaning metal of your submarine as the pressure builds. And then your proximity sensor starts beeping. Something massive is moving in the blood outside. The sheer terror of knowing something is out there, but having to wait for a slow, grainy photograph to process just to see the horror staring back at you makes Iron Lung one of the most nerve-wracking experiences in modern gaming. Level 7. Sad Satan. We've reached the bottom. Level 7. the Mariana Trench of gaming, a mysterious deep web horror game filled with disturbing sounds, hidden messages, and malicious files. Sad Satan first made waves in 2015 when a YouTube channel called Obscure Horror Corner claimed they had found it on the deep web, and that's when the legend started. But what is Sad Satan? It's not really a game in a traditional sense. There's no story or objectives. You just walk through endless claustrophobic hallways completely drenched in black and white. The deeper you go, the worse it gets. You hear distorted audio that is genuinely hard to sit through, some music playing in reverse, and slowed down audio clips of infamous historical dictators. Clone versions claiming to be the real Sad Satan started appearing on places like 4chan, and some of these clones were infinitely more dangerous for your hardware. They were basically just digital traps, heavily laced with aggressive ransomware and computer bricking viruses. Downloading the wrong file didn't give you a creepy game to play, it just permanently destroyed your machine. Even after all these years, nobody truly knows the full story behind Sad Satan. It remains one of the most disturbing and unsettling pieces of internet horror ever created. Killswitch. And finally, we end our descent with the myth of Killswitch. Created allegedly in 1989 by a highly secretive Russian company called the Karvina Corporation, it was a pioneer of the survival horror genre. You could play as a human woman named Porto or an invisible demon named Ghast. The game was notoriously difficult, full of cryptic puzzles and bizarre industrial environments, but the catch was brilliant and incredibly cruel. Killswitch was programmed to completely, irreparably delete itself from your hard drive the moment you beat it, or the moment your character died. You had one single shot to experience it. Only 5,000 copies were supposedly ever manufactured. Because of this self-deleting mechanic, the game slowly went extinct. Copies were played, players failed, and the code vanished forever. The legend ends in 2005, when a man named Yamamoto purportedly buying the very last known sealed physical copy at an auction for $733,000. He promised the internet he would stream his one and only playthrough to the world, preserving the game before it deleted itself. Thousands of people tuned in, but when the stream went live, there was no gameplay. All viewers saw was Yamamoto sitting at his computer in the pitch dark, quietly crying. The game had already erased itself. If you made it this far down the rabbit hole with me, thank you so much for watching. Researching this was intense, and diving into these lost files definitely leaves a mark. If you want to see me deep dive into another internet mystery, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Let me know in the comments which iceberg we should tackle next. Until then, stay safe online, watch what you download, and I'll see you in the next one.